लेडीज़ एंड जेंटलमैन, आप सबसे दरख्वास्त है कि आप अपनी नशिस्तों पे ही रहेंगे। हम बगैर ब्रेक के अपना अगला सेशन शुरू करेंगे, जिसका टाइटल है अपॉर्चुनिटीज़ द रोल ऑफ स्टेट। हमारे पास सिटी एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन, पाइड, वर्ल्ड बैंक से अहम स्पीकर्स होंगे जिनका तारुफ आपको अभी पेश किया जाएगा। सो वी नॉट हैविंग अ ब्रेक एंड वीर हैविंग एन इंपॉर्टेंट सेशन। सो आपसे दरख्वास्त है कि आप अपनी नशिस्तों पर मौजूद रहें ताकि हम अपना पैनल फ़ौरन शुरू कर सकें। और इम्पॉर्टेंटली अगले सेशन को चेयर करेंगे डॉक्टर इशरत हुसैन साहब, जो कि स्टेज पर मौजूद हैं। नेक्स्ट पैनलिस्ट को मैं दावत देना चाहता हूँ, वो आते जाएं। खालिद महमूद साहब, डिप्टी कमिश्नर पेशावर, आप काइंडली स्टेज पर आ जाइए। आई वुड लाइक टू रिक्वेस्ट मोहम्मद मोहसिन खान साहब, इज़ ऑलरेडी हियर विद अस। Gonzalo Verala sahab, Mr. Gonzalo from World Bank. Ma'am Nayab, I guess he's sitting with you. Yes. Omer Gillani sahab, partner at the Law and Policy Chambers, and he's an advocate High Court also. Kindly come out on the stage. And then I have my very own colleague Ahmad Waqar Qasim sahab. He's senior research economist at PIDE. I would request you all to kindly gather at the stage. अहमद वकार कासिम साहब। हमारा अगला सेशन अपॉर्चुनिटीज द रोल ऑफ स्टेट। दिस सेशन वुड बी चेयर्ड बाय डॉक्टर इशरत हुसैन, your former advisor to the Prime Minister on institutional reform and austerity, and you're also a former Governor, State Bank of Pakistan.
Well, thank you very much. Welcome to a very thinned audience after Taimur's very inspiring address. I think people are like to relax and reflect. Therefore, I'm very grateful to all of you who have decided to stay back. This is a highly controversial subject, the role of a state. Before I invite the panelists to ponder and reflect their views, let me give you my own, view that this whole debate of the state versus markets is completely irrelevant, outdated. Today, you need a very strong and effective state, and you also need a very vibrant and dynamic private sector, working hand to hand together in order to create the impulses which lead to inclusive and sustainable growth. That is the point I wanted to emphasize. So those who are still sort of warped in the 1950s, this is 2021, and things have really advanced. The third actor in the scene, which has become very prominent and is making contribution, is the civil society. So it's not only the state and the markets, but it is state, markets, and civil society all together working for the betterment of the society and the country. So that is how I would like to frame this debate, rather than have this adversarial relationship between the three different elements, which are the state, markets, and the civil society. I would not like to intervene at this stage, but I would request the speakers so speak for almost 10 minutes each, and when we will have a question and answers. And if there are any questions, I would post them within that 10 minutes. So let me begin with Khalid Mahmood is not here. Let me begin with Mr. Mohsen Khan, who is the director of IMSciences, and he needs no introduction. You all know him quite well. So Mohsen Saab, let me begin with you.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Saab. मेरे ख्याल में कुछ लोग चाय पीने के लिए गए हैं. That's why we have a tea break right now actually, which got delayed. So that is why many of us. we don't have a tree, but then that was probably an excuse. Topic, as you're familiar with, we're talking about opportunities. We are talking about the role of the government in creating those opportunities. 2 points I would like to mention at the outset, and then we'll go into what is the role of the government. And it will be mostly based on, I'll talk to you about what we're doing here in IMSciences, so that things that you looked up in Google, your own research, I don't really go back to that. Two things that I saw the other day in one of the papers was that the population, almost 2/3 of our population is in the range of 20 to 30 years age group. And that's the youth bulge that we were talking about yesterday in one of the sessions also. And we don't want that youth bulge to become a youth bomb. So jobs have to be created for them, or they have to create the jobs themselves. Another point that I wanted to mention, which is in one of the research papers, and everyone I think knows about it, that it takes the government almost 950,000 rupees to create a job. 950,000 rupees. Data is a couple of years old, so maybe it goes up now. And it takes the private sector 150,000 rupees to create a job. So there's a huge, vast difference. And if we accept that data, those figures. And so nowhere in the world the government should be in the business of creating business. One of the politicians, I thought it was Thatcher who said that, but now when I searched Google, Modi, he is attributing this quote to himself, so I'm a bit confused. But one of the political leaders, whether in the West or here, said that the government has no business to be in business. And that's very true. Thatcher, way back, I think it was in the 80s, started privatization of businesses. And she started off with the long unions that were in the coal mines and other government centers. So the best thing that we think is there to do is that the government from their side should provide an enabling environment. Okay, the bigger projects, let's say, for instance, for our economy, for our businessmen, they may not be able to create something like the BRT, the rapid bus system that we have here, and you need a lot of money for that, so the government can chip in. But then I think they should step out of it. By creating this BRT system, they have created very few jobs, but they have replaced a lot of bus drivers, conductors, and the allied businesses that go along with it. But there were particular reasons for that. How long will this new bus system be operative? Will the government be able to support it financially? Remains to be seen. We had previously a bus system which went out of business. Look at the railways, look at Pakistan Steel, look at PIA, many more. So which clearly shows that government should not be in business. Dr. Saab was talking about early 50s and 60s, a different set of environment framework was there. We had a lot of government-owned financial institutions. You may not remember them, but very good organizations like NTFC, IDBP, and a few more, Bell, Bankers Equity, etc. They did a lot of project financing, but they're out of business now because government was so much involved in it. I think I will stop here and let the other...
Let me clarify what I meant. 10 minutes was the total, but you may go for a few minutes of opening remarks, then I will ask questions of each of the panelists. So please consider 10 minutes as the maximum limit for all of you, and then we will have a question and answer from the audience. So next speaker is Mr. Gonzalo Verala, who is a senior economist from the World Bank. Gonzalo?
Thank you very much for the invitation to join this panel, and thank you, Dr. Hussain, for framing the question in a very interesting way. I think that I agree completely that the debate here is not only markets, only governments or state, but how do we want the state and the government to act in a way that facilitates the allocation of resources to the most productive uses. So how can it be an enabler so the economy can gradually transform itself and become a dynamic economy that creates jobs and opportunities for most. So I think if one poses the question like that, one can say that perhaps in Pakistan there are some challenges in that respect, because if one looks at what the government is doing and focusing on my area of expertise, that is productive development and trade, one can see that actually the revealed preference or the revealed actions of the state in many ways are to preserve the status quo rather than to facilitate a transformation. And the status quo in Pakistan today is not particularly good. We have very low investment rates, we have export competitiveness being low, we have productivity challenges. And let me mention three things, three examples of government policies that actually do more to preserve the status quo than actually to transform it. And I will start with something that perhaps not many of you know, that is the input-output coefficient organization. So this is an organization there's an agency in Karachi and an agency in Lahore, that basically the job they have is to determine what is the input ratio that a firm can use, so a certain input for its production process, to determine the extent to which it can be exempted from certain taxes, particularly import duties on those inputs. The fact that you have a bureaucrat determining those input-output coefficients rather than the firms themselves make it, for example, you would make it very difficult for Tesla to set shop in Pakistan, because that bureaucrat probably, when Elon Musk started producing the Tesla cars, would have said too much software for this car. That input-output ratio is not the right ratio. We don't want that much software because we use, Ford tires and the engine with this much steel, etc., etc. So if you have a bureaucrat determining your input-output coefficients, then it's likely that innovation, if you want to depart from the status quo, if you want to innovate and use different inputs, different technologies, then you're going to be stopped. And to use a word that PIDE likes a lot, there's going to be a lot of sludge to be able to actually make that innovation actually take place. The other example that I will bring is the example of export incentives that I use in Pakistan. I will mention DDT and DLTL, two incentives that are actively used by the government of Pakistan to promote exports. But there again, if you take, for example, a firm that decides to start exporting something, it has two options: to start exporting something new and to start exporting something that has been exported for a long time in Pakistan. If the firm decides to go for something that is already exported by Pakistan in established matters, let's say textile and apparel, the chance that it will be supported by the export incentives is 27%. So the export incentives make 27% of existing export products eligible, right? So you get that rebate from government. But if you say to innovate and try to export something new, which is already complicated in its own right, and try to see, okay, am I going to get that export incentive? The chance of getting the export incentive if you're doing something new is only 1.5%. So in other words, you're 18 times more likely to be supported by the export incentive if you are exporting the same old than if you're trying to do something new. So I'll stop here. We can mention more, but I would like to say for my next how governments can actually learn.
speaker is Omer Gillani. He's partner at the Law and Policy Chambers and advocate of High Court.
Ji, Assalamu alaikum. I'm very grateful to PIDE and to IMS for the invitation. So I have about 5 points that I want to make here about what the state can do to create opportunities. And I'm going to start with the first one, which is we have to enfranchise people, citizenship. It's a remarkable, unknown, untold fact about Pakistan that roughly 2.5% of all the people who live in this country do not have citizenship. That includes, and I am making this point particularly because we are hosting this conference in the city of Peshawar. There are about 3 to 4 million people of Afghan origin in this country who do not have the benefit of an ID card. And this is not a small matter because when we're talking about opportunities, we have to talk about those who are totally excluded. Then I'll come to the 97.5%. But this is the ID card which allows us to function in this country. And I call the attention of Dr. Nadeemul Haq here as well, because this issue is so urgent. Right now, at the gates of IMS, one of my friends and also one of my clients whom I'm representing in this cause is standing there and he can't get in. In fact, this is the reason why I got about 2 minutes late into this hall, because he is one of those 5 million people of Afghan, Bihari and Somali and Yemeni and Palestinian origin who are living in this country and they have zero opportunities. The law allows them citizenship because Pakistan continues to have the principle of jus soli, birthright citizenship, but they're actually not able to open a bank account. They're not even able to get inside these enclaved places. And one of them is standing right here at the gates of IMS and he can't get in. I wanted him to attend this session because I think it is his right to hear me speak about him. So the state, the finance minister was speaking about a very benign kind of state, but for at least that 2.5% of the population, this is not a very benign state. They are living in a state of statelessness. So we need to enfranchise everybody too. Language. The subcontinent is unique that the language of the state in this region is not the language of the people. There is absolutely, there's very little recognition in our economic circles, in the circles of economic thinkers about just how much exclusion happens by this little small trick of using this small little fact that the entire state structure functions in the English language, which is not very widely spoken or understood. So if you're not somebody who is competent to read or write English, you can't practically get a decent job in this country, and that includes probably more than 80-90% of the people. So these are some broad overview issues that I wanted to highlight. The state can do a lot by simply shifting the language of the state and start speaking in the language of the people, and that's what I am going to do. मुझे पश्तो नहीं आती, लेकिन उर्दू में बोल सकता हूँ और हमारे घर की ज़बान है, तो मैं बकिया गुफ्तगू उर्दू में करूँगा ताकि ऐसे दोस्त जो यहाँ पर काम करते हैं, जो यहाँ पर जिनको वो तालीमी मौक़े मुयस्सर नहीं आए जो मुझे और आपको आए हैं, वो भी मेरी गुफ्तगू सुन सकें. गोंजालो को मैं बाद में चाय की नशिस्त पे इंशाल्लाह इनको भी मैं आई विल प्रेजेंट अ समरी टू हिम, इनको खुलासा बयान करूँगा. तो जो तीसरी चीज़, एक तो मैंने आपको इस कार्ड का जिक्र किया, ये कार्ड सबको दें जिसके पास नहीं है. दूसरा, हम एंटरप्रेन्योरशिप की बात करें, हम जॉब क्रिएशन की बात करें. पाकिस्तान में कोई शख्स जो कारोबार करता है, अगर कोई शख्स वकील है तो उसके पास एक कार्ड होता है, इस्लामाबाद बार काउंसिल कार्ड, जो मैं अपने साथ लेके आया हूँ. अगर आप किसी अच्छी बड़ी दरसगाह में उस्ताद हैं तो आपके पास उसका लम्स का IMS का कार्ड होता है. अगर आप किसी बड़े रियासती इदारे से मुंसलिक हैं, जैसे कि अगर आप स्टेट बैंक से मुंसलिक हैं या वज़ीर आज़म हाउस से मुंसलिक हैं, तो आपके पास भी कोई शनाख्त होती है. لیکن اگر آپ پاکستان میں ایک چھوٹے تاجر یا چھوٹے کاروباری شخص ہیں, کسی نے بیوٹی پارلر کھول لیا ہے, کسی نے کمپوزنگ کی دکان کھول لی ہے, کسی نے جو ہے وہ بیسک آئی ٹی سروسز کی کوئی اپنے گھر میں ایک فرم کھولی ہے, تو اس کے پاس کوئی آئیڈینٹی نہیں ہے. اس کے پاس جتنے بھی روٹس ہیں ٹو گیٹ ہم سیلف اور ہر سیلف رجسٹرڈ ان دا اسٹیٹ اسٹرکچر, دے کم ود اے لائبلٹی. سو اف یو آر سول پروپرائٹر ہیئر, اگر آپ سول پروپرائٹر ہیں تو آپ کے پاس رجسٹریشن کا ایک ہی طریقہ ہے, وہ ایز اے بزنس پرسن ان ایف پی آر ہے. لیکن جس دن آپ نے وہ رجسٹریشن کرا لی, اس دن ایف پی آر آپ کے گلے لگ گیا. تو اسی لیے بہت سے لوگ یہ نہیں کرائیں گے. چیمبر آف کامرس کی رجسٹریشن کرانا بھی ایک راستہ ہے, لیکن اس میں بھی اس سے پہلے تمام قانونی لوازمات جیسے کہ ایف بی آر رجسٹریشن کروانا لازمی ہے. لیکن جیسے مجھے اور آپ کو ایک شناختی کارڈ ملتا ہے, اس کی کوئی دس کریٹس نو آبلیگیشنز آن مائی پارٹ, اٹ اونلی کریٹس آبلیگیشنز فار دا اسٹیٹ. اس قسم کا ایک کوئی کارڈ تو کم از کم ہم رجسٹریشن کرانا شروع کریں ان اسمال پروپرائٹرس کا, سول پروپرائٹرس کا اور ایس ایم ایز کا, جو ابھی تک شناخت سے محروم ہیں. دو باتیں اور عرض کروں گا. رجسٹریشن آف کانٹریکٹس. بزنس از نتھنگ بٹ, a firm is nothing but a set of contracts which brings it together. ایک کاروبار جو ہے, آپ اگر وکیل کی نگاہ سے اس کو دیکھیں تو وہ مختلف معاہدات کا مجموعہ ہے. ایک معاہدہ مالک اور ملازمین کے درمیان ہے, ایک معاہدہ اس کا کاروبار کا اپنے صارفین یا کسٹمرز کے ساتھ ہے, کوئی معاہدہ اس کا سروس پرووائڈرز کے ساتھ ہوگا, کوئی معاہدہ اس کا حکومت کے ساتھ ہوگا, لینڈ لارڈ کے ساتھ ہوگا. ہمارے ہاں معاہدات کی جو رجسٹریشن ہے, رجسٹریشن آف کانٹریکٹس کا کوئی باقاعدہ آسان نظام آزادی کے 70 سال کے بعد بھی ہم نے خود نہیں بنایا. اس وقت پاکستان میں جو رجسٹریشن آف کانٹریکٹس کا نظام ہے, رجسٹریشن ایکٹ 1908 اور اسٹیمپ ایکٹس کے بوتھ آف دیم کم ٹوگیدر ٹو فارم اٹ, اس سارے نظام کا جو بنیادی مقصد مطمع نظر تھا وہ ریونیو کلیکشن تھا. مثلا اگر آپ آج حیات آباد میں ایک کسی شخص سے زمین کرائے پہ لینا چاہیں گے, تو ہمارا کرائے کا قانون یہ کہتا ہے کہ آپ نے اس کو جا کے ایک جج کے پاس رجسٹر کرانا ہے, اور اس کی ایک بہت ہیوی رجسٹریشن فی ہے. اگر آپ کسی سے سو وی نیڈ ٹو ٹوٹلی ری تھنک آور سسٹم فار رجسٹریشن آف کانٹریکٹس. اور یہ کام ہم کر سکتے ہیں, اس میں کوئی چیز ہمیں مانے نہیں ہے. اس میں صرف سوچ کی اور توجہ کی اور اس طرف توجہ کی ضرورت ہے. دیکھیں ابھی انیویٹبلی میری گفتگو, سو I'll pause here and thank you so much.
The last panelist is Ahmad Waqar Qasim. He's a senior research economist at PIDE. So opening remarks and then we will
Thank you so much, Chair. In my opening remarks, I would like to make only one point on the topic of the role of state and opportunities. So my point is moving from opportunities to seek rent towards opportunity to excel. So a document produced by PIDE, the title the PIDE Reform Agenda, we came up with a very strong point that the market structure in Pakistan is highly regulated, and the state don't have the regulatory capacity. There are serious capacity issues too. So what does this highly regulated means? That there is a high administrative burden, and due to these administrative burdens, there is a lot of frictions in transactions when citizens interact with state agencies and the government. So these frictions, which is called sludge in generally, creates a lot of cost, that is monetary cost, time cost and other things. So these costs are actually hurting the transactions in the economy, and in one sense we can interpret GDP as the sum of transactions. If you have less frictions, there will be more transactions and then your GDP will grow. The literature from behavioral economics states that there is the human being have some cognitive bias, which means that we avoid these administrative burdens, even it means we are foregoing our long run benefits. So to remove these cognitive burdens, here comes the role of state, the role of institutes and their policy designs and their structure. So if the policy design has more frictions, more cost, the transaction happening is not there in the economy, so there will be low transactions. So in my opening remarks, as the chair said that the government should be enabler, although there are frictions in every transactions, every interaction between the state and the citizens, but the question is how much the magnitude of that friction exists. In case of Pakistan, as our findings in PIDE sludge series, this magnitude is very, very high. We have to bring it down, and state have to play the role to bring that friction down. So I will end here.
Well, thank you very much. Let me pose a question to the panelists. I think we got bogged down in very micro issues like the registration of contracts, the input-output coefficient. For efficient competitive markets to work, there are two very important prerequisites or preconditions. One is ease of enter the market and exit the market, and the second is the enforcement of contracts. On both these accounts, I think Pakistan is way behind. If you take any rule of law index, if you take any judicial reforms index, if you take the market competitiveness indices, Pakistan is way behind. Now, the opportunities you can create through a competitive market where these conditions are met are enormous compared to getting the ID cards for 2.5 million or the contract enforcement, registration, and getting the input coefficient organizations out. I would like the panel to provide us the way forward as to how we can proceed in order to create these conditions for the efficient working. And that will reduce the footprint of the government also, because the government today comes in because they say the markets are not functioning well. You have too much of collusion, you have the mafias, you have all kind of malpractices. So the government has to withdraw and retreat if you have these two preconditions. So I'll start with Mohsin Saab. I totally agree that the government is not in the business of providing jobs. As it is, only 6% of the entire civilian labor force is employed by the government. 94% is employed by the private sector. So we have to provide opportunities to the private sector and to the markets in order to create jobs. So I totally agree. But I want to take you to a bigger picture rather than very narrow, specific points. So I start with you, and then I'll come to Gonzalo, and then to Omer and Waqar.
I'll talk mainly about the provincial government here, what they're doing. As I said earlier, that the government was running businesses, they were running banks, etc., etc. So they, with their failures, they have learned. That's a good point. And now, rather than entering businesses, they are trying to create that environment, enabling environment. I'll just mention a few of the organizations that we have here. We have KPBOIT, which is Investment and Trade Office. Then we have KPITB, which is again KP IT Board. Then we have KP TEFTA. TEFTAs are everywhere. The technical and educational vocational centers. We have SMEDA here, and that's a federal agency also. So these institutions are helping. They are government-owned institutions, but they are not doing businesses themselves. They are helping the businesses to grow. When you mentioned the contract enforcement, sometimes the cultural issues come in. For instance, I'll quote a personal example. My brother has lent a sizable amount of money to a cousin for some business. That business failed. The amount was a loan agreement for which he had received predated checks. But when he even mentioned that in the family, that I'm going to go to court and I have the checks, the whole family was against him. That how can you do that to your cousin? So in personal, here many businesses are small businesses, and their you know, that is one area where cultural issues come in and you can't enforce those contracts. From the government side, yes, that is also there, issues are there. When I talk about these government institutions, I'll also talk about PESCO, for instance, the disco here, not the dancing disco, but the electricity disco, which is making us dance sometimes in hot weather, sometimes in cold weather, by cutting off or, you know, the power. So there, if you apply for a connection, it takes ages. If the industrial consumers apply for new connections, although they want industrial consumers, the process takes a long time. So then again, the government is doing, these DISCOs or agencies are also doing something to remove those hindrances. And that's where, when that is done, I think it will again take time and a change of attitude. Because the older employees there, they still think as if they're doing you a favor by giving you a connection. The newer ones are slightly different. So changes are taking place very slow, and I'm hopeful that the government will step in and, you know, as they require and as they need, they will step back from the businesses, they will create that environment that we need.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, the challenge is to ensure an environment, for the government to ensure an environment, to facilitate an environment in which all firms, going again to the productive development arena, all firms can enter, and those that are not good can exit. And so you have a dynamic, you know, creative destruction, Darwinian process there in the markets in which productive firms enter. If they are productive, they stay. We do not see, when we look at the data for Pakistan, and recently we issued the Pakistan Development Update that had a focus on exports, and we looked at exporters' data. And one of the things that we see is that effectively, as Dr. Hussain was mentioning, entry into markets is low. And if you look at how many new exporting firms there are every year in Pakistan, that number compares quite poorly with what we see in other more dynamic economies at a similar level of development, such as economies in East Asia and the Pacific. We're talking about 21% in Pakistan compared to about 40-45% that we see in East Asia Pacific economies at similar level of development. But I would like to say that again, one of the key determinants of those barriers to entry is that these barriers to entry are erected by those that are inside the system, and the government has a role to play there, because there are certain reforms that are costly in a number of respects that perhaps are not implemented, and what instead is implemented is changes in the margin that do not really solve the problem, but, you know, if just to use an Urdu word, sort of they introduce a jogar, no, like sort of a small solution that doesn't really addresses the problem structurally. And I can give an example. Import duties in Pakistan are extremely high, 20% on average. This is among the highest in the world. But if you look at effective rates applied, and if you look at effective revenues collected over total imports, it's lower. So if you look at the data more in detail, you see that actually there are many firms that import, for example, intermediates or capital equipment and do not pay the duty because they get an exemption. But getting an exemption is a complicated matter that is accessible for the larger firm that is already there, but not for the new small firm that is not. And so that insider dynamic, I think, is important here. And I will echo what our regional chief economist mentioned yesterday on how perhaps the disruption can happen through technology, and how, if you look at what is happening in the services sector in Pakistan, you have many more very small firms that are managing to get into export markets, perhaps because these firms, these IT software exporters of business services, designers, etc., there are 5,500 firms that are registered in SBP and that actually export, of an average of $200,000 a year. So they're tiny in the services sector, dynamic, and not affected by regulations. So I think the challenges of regulations and how regulations actually introduce these entry barriers cannot be understated, when one compares merchandise trade with services trade and how different the landscape is there. So.
Thank you.
So I totally agree with Dr. Saab on this point that enforcement of contracts is probably the biggest failure of our judicial system, the judicial arm of the state. I think I'm personally grateful that at least one lawyer has been invited to this conference, because one of the reasons why we have not been able to fix this issue is because of the total separation between the profession of law and economics. So the judicial arm of the state has very little economic sense, and very little effort has been made as a polity by us to engage with the judicial arm and to reform it, because the judicial arm will inevitably be the arm that deals with issues of contract enforcement. That is the principal job, the raison d'etre of the judicial arm, to enforce contracts. But they will not change their behavior unless there is a serious engagement with the judiciary by the civil society, by the business community, by the government, by the political parties on this issue. پاکستان میں کانٹریکٹ کی انفورسمنٹ عدالت کے ذریعے سے کروانا کیوں مشکل ہے، اس کی میرے خیال سے دو بنیادی وجوہات ہیں. ایک تاریخی وجہ ہے، ڈاکٹر صاحب کی کتاب میں بھی ایک پورا چیپٹر ڈیڈیکیٹڈ ہے اس ایشو پہ، اینڈ ون آف مائی آرٹیکلز ہیز بین کوٹڈ دیئر. ایک جو بہت بنیادی وجہ ہے کہ کیوں ہماری عدالتیں کانٹریکٹ انفورسمنٹ کے بارے میں اس طرح سے سنجیدگی کا مظاہرہ نہیں کرتی کہ ہم نے 3 مہینے میں ایک کانٹریکٹ کو انفورس کروانا ہے. اس کی وجہ یہ ہے کہ یہ جو ہماری دیوانی عدالتیں ہیں یا سول کورٹس ہیں، یہ ان کا اوریجن ریونیو کورٹس میں تھا. اسی لیے دیوان کا منصب جو مغل امپائر میں تھا وہ تو ایک ریونیو کا منصب تھا، وہ کانٹریکٹ انفورسمنٹ کا یا قضاء کا منصب تو نہیں تھا. سو دیر از اے بیسک اسٹرکچرل ہسٹوریکل بائس اگینسٹ دس ایشو. ہماری عدالت بنیادی طور پر لوگوں کے لینڈ جو ڈسپیوٹس ہیں اس کو پیسفلی ریزالو کرانے کے لیے بنی تھی. اسی لیے وہ لینڈ ڈسپیوٹ کو لینے کے بعد اس کو ایک 20, 30, 40 سال تک چلاتے ہیں، اور اس دوران میں جو گاؤں میں دونوں وارنگ فیکشنز ہیں ان کے درمیان ان کو ایک آؤٹ لیٹ مل جاتا ہے. دیٹ از دا بیسک اسٹرکچر جس کے اراؤنڈ یہ نظام بنا تھا. انفارچونیٹلی دیٹ از ناٹ گیئرڈ اپ ایٹ آل فار 21st century کانٹریکٹ انفورسمنٹ. اس میں کیا تبدیلی کی جا سکتی ہے؟ So there is a historical bias that this system was not meant for speedy and efficient, expeditious commercial contract enforcement. It was meant for an agrarian dispute resolution system. The other is spending. What are we spending on the judicial arm of the state? So I did the math a few years ago when I was assisting the Supreme Court on this issue. It seems very clearly that less than 1% of the budgets of the federation or of the provinces is being spent on the judiciary. So the structure that we have is primarily a privately funded one. یعنی اگر آپ نے عدالت میں کوئی مقدمہ حل کروانا ہے تو اس میں ایک آدمی سرکار کا تنخواہ دار بیٹھا ہوا ہے، جج، اور 2 وکلاء ہیں. اور بنیادی طور پہ جو ہمارا ایڈورسریل لیگل سسٹم ہے جو ہم نے انگلش سسٹم انہیرٹ کیا ہے، یہ لائر ڈریون ہے. اس میں جو فیکٹس اور لا دونوں کو اکٹھا کرنا، ان کو افیکٹولی پلیڈ کرنا، ایون کیس مینجمنٹ یعنی کہ اپنے مقدمے کو صحیح وقت پہ لگوا کے چلوانا، یہ بنیادی طور پہ وکیل کی ذمہ داری ہے. سو اٹس اے پرائیویٹلی فنڈڈ سسٹم. اور اس میں اسی لیے جہاں دونوں پارٹیاں ایکسٹریملی ویل ہیلڈ ہوں، وہاں بعض اوقات کانٹریکٹ جلدی انفورس ہو بھی جاتا ہے. دے ول گو انٹو انٹرنیشنل آربیٹریشن، کم بیک اینڈ انفورس دی foreign arbitral award. So there are some loopholes, as Gonzalo said, there are some jugards out there. Lekin overall, we have not spent enough on the judiciary. Like, we have spent a lot more on roads. We have spent, I can't find a courtroom in this country which would be, and maybe this is a tribute to IMS, बट IMS के हॉल का एक फ्रैक्शन के बराबर भी अच्छा वेल मेंटेन्ड वेल फंडेड कोर्ट रूम हमें इस मुल्क में नहीं मिलता. सो हिस्टोरिकली हमारी रियासत ने अदलिया के ऊपर और ख़ास तौर पे सिविल कोर्ट्स पे फोकस नहीं किया. दैट नीड्स टू चेंज.
I beg to humbly disagree because the lawyers play a very critical role in getting the stay orders, and if it is in their favor, the stay orders gain the momentum of their own life and the decisions are not taken. So I think we have to recognize the reality. It's not the money or the judicial expenditure on judiciary. The judges today are paid huge amounts of salaries, allowances, pensions. So that I don't think is an issue. And now the courts are being constructed, and the case management system was to be completely computerized and digitalized, but there is a lot of resistance from the lower staff. So I think we have to recognize what the realities are rather than get into either the historical context or saying that this is for a reasons of lack of expenditure. So I have my submission to you. Waqar, you have talked about the footprint of the government is quite intrusive, and I agree with you. Although from the national accounts expenditure breakdown, it's only 20% of GDP which is in the government. But through the taxation, through the regulatory, through the policy, the government is very much intrusive. I totally agree. What can we do? I mean, we are very good at diagnostics and identifying what the problems are. But PIDE, being one of the leading research institutions, should not completely tread on the downtrodden path, but come up with the innovative, practical solutions. So how do we go about that? And I would like to listen to your views.
Well, sir, you are absolutely right that there is a large government footprint. The recent study came out in PIDE, calculate that the government footprint ranges from 60 to 80% of the GDP. So it's a huge footprint. And you rightly mentioned that our market structure is not working efficiently. No, we have to explore why it is not working efficiently. In my view, there are two main reasons. First is our market structure is over-regulated and our incentive structure is not in place. We are incentivize the rent seeking as compared to innovations and startups. So coming back to your question, what would be the role of the state to make it more efficient? Let me use the analogy borrowed from Dr. Nadeem, the cricket. In cricket, the ICC set rules and place one umpire during the match who just enforce the rules. And the ICC does not act as a player during the field. So two teams play each other's, ICC just set the rules and enforce the rules. Same is the case in the government. Government is supposed to set the rules of the game and then enforce it through their agencies and don't act as a player in the market. So here is the issue. So what we are suggesting is that government should stay out of the market, just set the rules, develop your enforcement capacity and enforce those rules efficiently.
But Waqar, you know this, that the government players in the market are the most handicapped. They have their hands tied behind their backs. They cannot compete with the private sector, so they don't have any advantage. I was looking at the Pia Restructuring. While a private sector airline can get the spare parts which they need within 24 hours and get their planes, flying, PIA has to go through the PEPRA rules, which require 15 days to give a tender. By the time their all flights are cancelled and the flights are suspended and the customers are all, saying we won't go to the PIA, we will go to Air Sial, we will go to Serene Air, and they're losing the market share. So I don't think that the player analogy to me is a very appropriate as far as the government's own role is concerned. Although I totally agree that government should be out of business in comparative markets, and therefore I'm very keen that there should be, in real sense, comparative markets. Well, I think we have to open up the floor for questions. I will certainly like the audience to participate because you have all come here to have interaction. So I'll start with this gentleman here. Please identify yourself, but keep your question brief so that I can provide opportunities to others. This conference is for opportunities. So don't give speeches, but please ask a precise question. And to the panelists, if you can name which panelist you want to do that.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Mohammad Shahid Waid and I am researcher at IB, PhD fellow at Applied Economics Research Center. सर मेरा सवाल PM एडवाइज़र साहब से है, इशरत हुसैन साहब से, कि सर हम पाकिस्तान में मार्केट को प्रमोट क्यों नहीं कर रहे? हम जैसे झगड़ा साहब ने भी कहा कि यार किसी ने BS नहीं करना, मास्टर नहीं करना, PhD नहीं करना, हमने प्रोडक्शन को भी प्रमोट करना है। प्रोडक्शन हमारे यहाँ, हमारा सारा फोकस, हम जितनी भी नई जनरेशन हमारी आ रही है, हम उसको किस पे लगा रहे हैं? अंग्रेज़ी सीखने पे लगा रहे हैं। मैं टाई लगा के, लिपस्टिक लगा के मशीन के सामने अगर खड़ा हूँ, उसने कुछ प्रोड्यूस नहीं करना, हम प्रोडक्शन की तरफ आ नहीं रहे। गिलानी साहब ने बड़े अच्छे पॉइंट्स रेस किए कि हमारे मुल्क में काम करने वाले लोग जो हैं वो अफ़गानी लोग हैं, वो मेहनत करते हैं बचपन से, उसने पढ़ना नहीं है, लेकिन हम उनको जब तक आइडेंटिटी नहीं देंगे, उनके पास पैसा है लेकिन उसका घर जो है वो अभी भी कच्चा है, इसलिए क्योंकि उनको पता है कि मैंने 3 साल रहना है, 5 साल रहना है। तो हमने एक बहुत बड़ी, वो जो हमारे पास यूथ है और लेबर फोर्स जो है उसको हमने इग्नोर किया हुआ है। दूसरा, हमारे पाकिस्तानियों की इस तरफ रुझान है ही नहीं। तीसरा, मेरा जो सवाल है वो हमारे एक्सपोर्ट डिमांड की तरफ से है। आप अगर हम देखें, अफ़गानिस्तान, ताजिकिस्तान, उज़्बेकिस्तान में एग्रीकल्चर डिमांड काफ़ी हाई है और पाकिस्तान पाबंदी लगा के भी हम एग्रीकल्चर फूड्स जो हैं, जैसे मैं गंदम की मिसाल लूँ, फिर भी वो ब्लैक में एक्सपोर्ट होता है। आप खुद ही अंदाज़ा लगाएं कि उसकी कितनी अच्छी कीमत मिलती होगी। तो हम इंडस्ट्री को तो सब्सिडी दे के उनको कहते हैं कि आप शुगर एक्सपोर्ट करें, लेकिन हमारा जो लोकल एग्रीकल्चर प्रोड्यूसर है उसको हम ये फैसिलिटी क्यों नहीं दे रहे, या मुझे ये फैसिलिटी क्यों नहीं मिल रही है IBA के उसके, कि मैं इंडिया से गंदम ख़रीदूं और उसको बड़े मुनाफे पे मैं अफ़गानिस्तान में या ताजिकिस्तान में एक्सपोर्ट कर सकूं। गवर्नमेंट ये बॉर्डर बंद क्यों रखती है? थैंक यू।
देखें, एक्सपोर्ट का जहाँ तक ताल्लुक़ है, आप बिल्कुल सही फरमा रहे हैं, लेकिन जब आपकी डोमेस्टिक कंजम्पशन 30 मिलियन टन की है और आपकी डोमेस्टिक प्रोडक्शन 27 मिलियन टन की है, तो आपका तो गैप है। आप 3 मिलियन टन तो आप इंपोर्ट कर रहे हैं, आप एक्सपोर्ट कैसे करेंगे? तो सबसे पहला हमारा फ़र्ज़ ये है कि हमारा जो स्मॉल फार्मर है जिसकी यील्ड जो है वो 3 टन से भी कम है, उसको हम सर्टिफाइड सीड्स दें, उसको एग्रीकल्चर क्रेडिट दें, उसको फर्टिलाइज़र दें, ताकि वो अपनी यील्ड बढ़ा सके। और जब हमारी यील्ड बढ़ेगी तो उसके बाद हमारे पास एक्सपोर्ट के लिए सरप्लस होगा। इस वक्त हम नहीं कर सकते। अफ़गानिस्तान को अगर भेजेंगे तो यहाँ की प्राइसेस जो हैं वो कहाँ से कहाँ पहुँच जाएंगी और इन्फ्लेशन जो है वो बढ़ जाएगा। दूसरी बात जो मैं आपसे कहना चाह रहा हूँ कि हमारे यूनिवर्सिटीज़ में रिवाज हो गया है कि सिर्फ हम डिग्री के ऊपर तवज्जो देते हैं, ग्रेड्स के ऊपर तवज्जो देते हैं, रट के हम लेक्चर जो है वो इम्तहान में रिप्रोड्यूस कर देते हैं। टीचर्स भी कहते हैं शॉर्टकट मारो, ये इम्पॉर्टेंट क्वेश्चंस हैं, ये की है, इसको याद कर लो। उनमें ना नॉलेज आती है, ना उनमें कोई स्किल सेट आता है। अब जो हमने करना है वो है कि हमने एंटरप्रेन्योर्स जिनको के रिस्क टेकिंग भी आती हो और अपनी नॉलेज का इस्तेमाल भी आता हो, जब तक कि आप ये नहीं करेंगे उस वक्त तक हम आगे नहीं बढ़ेंगे। IBA है, लम्स है, IMSciences है, IBA सक्कर है, बिट्यूमस है, उन्होंने अब एंटरप्रेन्योरशिप के सेंटर्स शुरू किए हैं। वहाँ पर इंक्यूबेटर्स भी हैं, एक्सेलरेटर्स भी हैं, ताकि वो ख़ुद अपनी बिज़नेस स्टार्ट करें। लेकिन इवन इन अमेरिका 10 न्यू स्टार्टअप्स में से 2 या 1 जो है वो कामयाब होता है, 7 या 8 जो उसमें से होते हैं वो नाकाम होते हैं। लेकिन उससे आपको डर के विथड्रॉ नहीं करना है, बल्कि कोशिश करनी है कि हम इसको कैसे इम्प्रूव करें। और सिर्फ 15% पॉपुलेशन जो है वो रिस्क टेकर है, बाकी लोग जो हैं वो रिस्क न्यूट्रल हैं या रिस्क एवर्स हैं। तो आप हर एक से उम्मीद नहीं कर सकते वो एंटरप्रेन्योर बनेगा। तो ये हमारे एजुकेशन सिस्टम की नुक्स है, लेकिन अल्लाह के फजल से अब यूनिवर्सिटीज़ में शुरू हुआ है और काफ़ी कामयाबी हो रही है। और गोंजालो साहब ने जैसे बताया कि आईटी सेक्टर में इस वक्त हम $2 बिलियन से ज़्यादा की एक्सपोर्ट कर रहे हैं। वो आप जैसे लोग जो यूनिवर्सिटी से निकल रहे हैं, उन्होंने अपनी सॉफ्टवेयर कंपनीज बनाई हैं, बिज़नेस प्रोसेस इंजीनियरिंग कर रहे हैं, बिज़नेस आउटसोर्सिंग कर रहे हैं, और वो बेचारे पढ़े लिखे लोग हैं, उनको कोई हुकूमत से मदद नहीं मिलती है। तो मेरी आप सबसे रिक्वेस्ट है कि वो आप डिग्रीज़ को चेस करना छोड़ दें, बल्कि जॉब्स आपको चेस करें। आप में इतनी अहलियत होनी चाहिए, ये तालीम का मकसद है, फिर आपकी बात जो है वो सही होगी।
Assalamu alaikum. This is Ahmadullah Qazi. I am representing the International Labour Organization of the United Nations. First of all, I would congratulate IMSciences to be hosting such a successful event and be coming back as an official to this, which has been my alma mater. Now coming back to this agenda point, that is opportunities, the role of state. I've been listening to the previous session and this session, and there's 2-3 points that I think that I would want to listen from the panel is. One is still, although we've touched upon various points, but we've still not discussed the major concern that recently we've been having is, and that is formalizing the informal sector, because there's a major part of the economy that continues to remain as an informal, so that doesn't come under the documentation. So whenever you're doing financial planning, I don't see how effective that is. Then, as you know that we are a signatory, that we have the GSP plus status, and there's a lot of debate going on nationally lately on our compliance levels at the international conventions, especially the 8 core UN conventions. That gives us that trade opportunity to be able to export to the EU, and that also gives us access to a lot of markets. So how effective the governments can be in that. 3, in the recent session, we also discussed about, and we feel pride as a KP province that we've achieved universal social protection. But we also need to also see how sustainable that move is in the long run, because the PTI's government is backing it because it's an initiative, but how long can that run? And finally, Ishrat Saab, I remember last time we met in Islamabad, and you were putting a lot of efforts on optimizing the government structure and at least getting rid of the non-functional or non-effective public sector bodies to be able to be better managed as a government. So I would also want to hear from you, and I think would be of an interest to the audience to see, when you speak of opportunities, how is the government restructuring itself to be more effective? Thank you.
Ask 4 questions. So I think I'll request the panel to answer the last question I will answer, which is on the non-effective public sector. But Mohsin Saab, you want to, or Waqar, you want to?
Yes, sir. I would like to respond to the first question, that is the formalize the informal sector. So my response is that why we love to formalize or regulate everything. So this debate to formalize the informal sector is basically representing our rhetoric that, so what's the objective of formalizing the informal sector? To collect the tax revenue. So our government want to formalize just to collect tax, not to provide the incentives. So if you look at the informal sector, they are performing more efficiently compared to formal sectors. So if I am an entrepreneur, I have a small shop, I get listed with FBR, and then I close up my business, to get unlisted from the FBR income tax is more difficult and more challenging than to get registered at the first place. So again and again, there is over-regulations. That's why the businessman, the informal sector exists, and it's large. So we have to think about why we love to formalize or regulate everything.
Yeah, I'll take, there was part of the 4 questions that one of them looked at was about a GSP Plus. And so GSP Plus is a very important scheme for Pakistan and Pakistani exporters to access duty-free in some developed countries' markets. I would see GSP Plus, that is due to be renewed at the end of 2023, to be a platform for learning of how to move into a world in which, for example, environmental standards are going to be very important. And so firms will need to produce with certain environmental standards, which will imply changes in the way they produce things, but also it will imply being able to certify that what they are doing is compliant with those standards. So in that respect, and going back to the topic of the role of the state, I think what the role of the state or the government in this respect is to facilitate access to environmental goods and services that are needed for these firms to comply with these standards, and that is going to be the only way in which you're going to see a possibility of upgrading of these firms in Pakistan and selling at higher prices in international markets. Over.
इनफॉर्मेलिटी के हवाले से आई थिंक ये बहुत कोर और अहम डिबेट है, वी नीड टू हैव मोर ऑफ इट. लीगल डायमेंशन में देखें, इनफॉर्मेलिटी की एक मैनिफेस्टेशन ये है कि पाकिस्तान में बहुत कम लोग अपने मुआहदात या कॉन्ट्रैक्ट्स हैं वो लिखते हैं, और अगर कोई लिख भी लेता है तो वो उसको कहीं थर्ड पार्टी रजिस्टर में नहीं लाता. एंड दिस इज़ समथिंग, मेरा ख्याल है कि अगर हम रजिस्ट्रेशन फॉर्मलाइजेशन को रजिस्ट्रेशन के एंगल से कि लोग अपने आप को FBR में रजिस्टर कराएं, उस एंगल से देखने की बजाय उसको हम इस लीगल एंगल से देखें कि ठीक है, एक फर्म है जो अनरजिस्टर्ड है, लेकिन उसने अपने मुआहदात जो लोगों के साथ किए हैं, अपने सप्लायर्स के साथ, कस्टमर्स के साथ, एम्प्लॉयज़ के साथ, लैंडलॉर्ड्स के साथ, टेनेंट्स के साथ, सो ऑन, वो तमाम मुआहदात उसने कहीं रजिस्टर किए हुए हैं. द रीज़न वाई दिस इज़ नॉट हैपनिंग इज़ बिकॉज द स्टेट अनफॉर्चुनेटली इज़ अ शॉर्ट साइटेड व्यू. स्टेट हमेशा जो भी फॉर्मलाइजेशन का रास्ता बनाती है वो रेवेन्यू पर्सपेक्टिव से बनाती है या ऑब्लिगेशंस के पर्सपेक्टिव से बनाती है. अगर आप बिज़नेस के पर्सपेक्टिव से कोई ऐसा फॉर्मलाइजेशन का पर्सपेक्टिव बनाएं जिसका फ़ायदा बिज़नेस को, रियासत को ना हो, तो शायद दैट विल बी मोर पॉपुलर.
One on the sustainability of the universal social protection. It is a minuscule proportion of our GDP today, what we are spending. Despite the fact that PTI government is very much committed to universal self-protection and Asas program has been expanding, it is still about 1% of GDP. While we are wasting money on inefficient public enterprises and across the board subsidies on electricity, 24 million consumers are getting electricity subsidies, which goes about 600 billion rupees. Can't that be diverted for the benefit of the poor people of this country who deserve it? That is what the government should be doing. Tax progressively from the well-to-do segments of the population who are making money extraordinarily, and use some of that in order to provide protection to the poor of this country who cannot afford. That is the whole welfare state concept, which Nordic countries are following today, and we should also be following that. So I don't think the sustainability is a question, because if we plug in all the waste and inefficiencies of the government, we can save more and spend on social protection. On the non-effective public sector, there were 441 organizations working in the federal government. They have been reduced now to 307. Some of them have been liquidated or wound up. Some of them have been merged. Some of them have been given to the private sector for privatization, like the discos. And that is the way 71,000 jobs, vacancies were completely abolished from the government. So you are reducing the size of the government in order to become more, prudent as far as the financial management is concerned. So that's the answer to your question.
Okay, so I have the mic.
Rahman Villahan, PhD scholar at IMSciences. Sir, my question is with regard to contract enforcement. I think the state is also accountable toward its citizens and society to enforce its contracts and deliver upon the responsibilities it is entrusted with. And the other supplementary question is that international financial institutions such as IMF, World Bank, and the like, whenever they lend to such states, they have also ethical and moral responsibility to make such states accountable whether they have reduced inequality, as was the topic of yesterday's lecture, and whether the state has enforced its contracts with its citizens. Thank you.
कॉन्ट्रैक्ट इन्फोर्समेंट रियासत की सबसे बुनियादी जिम्मेदारी है, और ये बिल्कुल आप सही पॉइंट आउट कर रहे हैं, डॉक्टर साहब ने भी इस पे एम्फेसाइज किया, एंड दैट इज़ ट्रू. एंड इनफैक्ट आई एडमिट कि दी जुडिशल ब्रांच ऑफ द स्टेट, जिसमें वकला और जजेस शामिल हैं, उनका बहुत बड़ा फेलियर है. वी हैव फेल्ड पाकिस्तान ऑन दिस ग्राउंड, एंड आई पर्सनली एज अ लॉयर फील कमिटेड टू द कॉज कि हम अगर ये काम देखें ना, सबसे जो अहम सर्विस अदालत एक आम इंसान को प्रोवाइड करती है वो तो यही है कि उसका अगर कोई मुआहदा था, उसकी पाबंदी नहीं हो रही, तो वो उसके मुआहदे, दूसरी पार्टी से उसके मुआहदे की पाबंदी कराई जाए. हाउ वी कैन डू इट इज़ समथिंग, यू नो, वी नीड टू हैव अ लॉन्ग, वी नीड टू चार्ट आउट अ लॉन्ग टर्म प्लान, एंड हाउ वी कैन डू इट. दिस इज़ समथिंग आई कांट आउटलाइन इन अ मिनट.
वी आर कंस्ट्रेन्ड बाय टाइम. मुझे ऑर्गेनाइजर्स ने कहा है कि 1 बजे हमने ख़त्म करना है. ये बड़ा पेशेंट ऑडियंस है, सुबह से बैठे हुए हैं ये, तो आई वांट टू गिव देम सम रिलीफ ऑल्सो. अच्छा चलें, आप मोहसिन साहब कह रहे हैं तो इनको ना नहीं कर सकता मैं.
जी अस्सलाम वालेकुम. मेरा सवाल, आई एम मोहम्मद हारिस मोहसिन फ्रॉम पंजाब यूनिवर्सिटी. मेरा जो हमारे पैनल में लॉयर बैठे हैं, इनसे सवाल है एक बेसिक. आप बात कर रहे थे ऑफ द फंड्स. अभी इस्लामाबाद में न्यू हाई कोर्ट की बिल्डिंग जो है वो शारे दस्तूर पे बन रही है, ठीक है. इवन दो इस्लामाबाद हैज़ अ बिग हाई कोर्ट ऑलरेडी, जिसको एक्सपेंड किया जा सकता है. इसके अलावा मुख्तलिफ शहरों में सेशन कोर्ट्स की न्यू इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर डेवलप हो रहा है, ठीक है. जो जुडिशरी है वो सर्दियों की छुट्टियाँ करती है, गर्मियों की छुट्टियाँ करती है, हफ्ते को भी छुट्टी करती है, इतवार को भी छुट्टी करती है, ठीक है. मुझे ये बताएं कि आपकी ऑनरेबल जुडिशरी को कौन रोकता है गवर्नमेंट से फंड्स लेने के लिए, जो कि एक वाइटल ऑर्गन है ज़ाहिर स्टेट का, फंड्स लेने के लिए कि वो जो हमारी कॉन्ट्रैक्ट इन्फोर्समेंट है और जो हमारी इंडस्ट्रीज़ हैं इनकी लिटिगेशन को जल्दी सॉल्व करें. दैट इज़ अ बर्निंग क्वेश्चन. आपको इसका जवाब देना चाहिए. थैंक यू.
So I feel a bit singled out here, but I suppose कि अगर इंसान अपने जुर्म का इतराफ़ कर ले तो वो बेहतरीन स्ट्रेटजी होती है, तो इसमें कोई शुबा नहीं है. देखिए, I feel, so I am not from a lawyer's family, but as a professional I do feel associated with this institution, and the citizens of this country, they have a right to shame us. They have a right to shame the judicial branch कि आपने अपना सबसे, सारी दुनिया के कामों में आपने टांग अड़ाई, जो आपका सबसे बुनियादी काम था. आपने हुकूमत को के कामों में टांग अड़ाई, लोगों को, बिजनेसमैनों को तंग किया, प्रोफेशनल्स को तंग किया, और अपना जो काम था, एजुकेशन इंस्टीट्यूशंस में घुस गए. जो अपना सबसे बुनियादी काम था कि 2 आदमी आए हैं कहते हैं हमारा मुआहदा है, इसने ज़्यादती की है, इसको डिसाइड करो कि किसने ज़्यादती की है, वो काम हम नहीं कर पाते, उसमें 30 साल लग जाते हैं. सो I represent a very small group of lawyers. हम तो इस बारे में, we have set up an alternative bar politics forum and we try to address this issue. But आपको भी करना चाहिए, ये मुल्क आपका भी है, सिर्फ वकीलों का, जजों का नहीं है. आप अपना हक मांगें और अदलिया को रिफॉर्म करें. Parliament is there for you. The educational institutions, these, PIDE has taken a great initiative by flagging this issue कि contract enforcement में हम कहाँ fail कर रहे हैं. So we can all take this country forward. I really hope we can all do that.
Well, I want to thank all of you. I don't have much to say because this is an ongoing debate. This is not going to settle down. There are in the state 3 different pillars of the state. One is the executive branch, then you have judiciary, and then you have Parliament, and each one of them has a responsibility to the citizens to do what is the best interest of the citizens. So adversarial relations, again, I would emphasize, are not going to do any good to either the citizens or to the country as a whole. So we have to demarcate our boundary according to the Constitution and carry out our responsibilities rather than intruding in the territory of the other. The second is that within the executive branch, it is my belief, and I can vouch this with the empirical evidence, that the delivery of basic public services can only improve if you have an empowered local government system where the communities and the grassroots citizen level participate in the decision making for themselves. The top-down policies thrust upon the citizens haven't worked and will not work. So unless we have adequate resources, both financial and human, devoted to the communities and the grassroots level at the local governments, with the active participation of the civil society, I can assure you that we are going to complain about the ineffectiveness of the state all the time. So on the pillars, each one has to perform. On the executive branch, let us give more devolution from the provincial governments to the local governments. Let them be elected by the people so that they can be held accountable. But all the institutions, like in Lahore, Lahore Development Authority, the Water Sewerage Authority, the Solid Waste Disposal, the Education Department, the Health Department, should be under a directly elected mayor who carries out the responsibilities which are required for the uplift and the development of the Lahore as a city, but also for the citizens. So that is where I consider that you can have a very effective role for the state. Thank you very much for the panel members for their participation, and to all of you for staying and taking part in this dialogue. Thank you very much.